Hi.
Hello, everybody. Ray Franz 246 and In Search of Christian Freedom. The subhead is Legalism's Subtle Invasion. The organization's own history shows that, basically, the so-called great body of theocratic law began its growth during the presidency of the second president of the Watchtower Society, Joseph F. Rutherford, from 1916 to 1942. For during the presidency of the founder of the society, Charles Taze Russell, from 1881 to 1916, the organization was notably free of legalism. Following Russell's death and Rutherford's election to the presidency, a totally different tone and spirit manifested itself in the organization's administration. Rutherford was not a person inclined to tolerate disagreement. We have already seen that A.H. Macmillan, a close associate of Rutherford, said that, quote, he would never tolerate anything that would be contrary to what he clearly understood the Bible to teach, unquote. This statement reveals not only the propensity for control the society's president had and the enormous authority with which he had vested himself, but also that it was his understanding of what the scriptures taught which determined what all members must be guided by. Those of us among the witnesses who lived during that presidency know that being theocratic came to mean that we would accept virtually without question whatever instructions were received from the headquarters organization.
We have seen the manner in which field service became essentially a work of law for all members. This initial step was followed by others as additions to the great body of theocratic law. During Rutherford's presidency, it came to include such matters as the refusal to salute a flag or stand for a national anthem, refusal to accept alternative service provided for those who had conscientious objections to military service, all issues not specifically dealt with in Scripture.
If individuals on the basis of personal conviction could not conscientiously engage in any or all of these things, then they rightly should abstain. But none of these matters were left to individual conscience. They now became organizational law, and adherence to that law in all respects was required for one to be counted a faithful Christian. Nonetheless, during Rutherford's lifetime, the volume of laws developed was tiny compared to what was to follow, while those failing to follow them were looked down upon as compromisers. No punitive measures such as disfellowshipping were taken toward them on a congregational level. In other areas, only conduct that showed severe violations of morality brought disfellowshipment, and during my early years of association, these expulsions seemed quite rare. There was certainly not the inclination to scrutinize people's lives that later became so common. Now, in this paragraph, he refers to Romans 14 to mark a contrast between Christianity as practiced even in the days of the apostles and this system of theocratic law that was coming in with a vengeance in the 1950s. So we want to read Romans 14, 5 to 12, and 22 and 23.
One man considers one day more sacred than another. Another man considers every day alike. Each one should be fully convinced in his own mind. He who regards one day as special does so to the Lord. He who eats meat eats to the Lord, for he gives thanks to God. And he who abstains does so to the Lord, and gives thanks to God. For none of us live to himself alone, and none of us dies to himself alone. If we live to the Lord, and if we die to the Lord. So whether we live or die, we belong to the Lord. For this very reason, Christ died and returned to life, so that he might be Lord of both the dead and the living. You then, why do you judge your brother? Or why do you look down on your brother? For we will all stand before God's judgment seat. It is written, As surely as I live, says the Lord, Every knee will bow before me. Every tongue will confess to God. So then, each of us will give an account of himself to God. So whatever you believe about these things, keep between yourself and God. Blessed is the man who does not condemn himself by what he approves, but the man who has doubt is condemned if he eats, because he is eating not from faith, and everything that does not come from faith is sin.
Well, even though the apostles were alive, probably most of them were alive when this was written in the late 50s of the first century, it's obvious that a lot of things would be left to conscience, not to any rule that was imposed by, after all, they had absolute authority inherited from Christ, didn't they? But they knew about humans what apparently the Watchtower has generally forgotten, namely that humans don't grow and mature at the same rate.
Yeah. Well, this just proves there's no established rule. It's leaving room for disagreements, for different levels of maturity and understanding.
Background.
For different opinions. So he doesn't just say, okay, well now this is the rule. You don't eat, or you do eat. Like, he doesn't give a rule. He still leaves it up to them to decide what their own conscience and heart tells them is allowable or not allowable for them.
Yeah, that's right. So because many of them would come from a Jewish background, they would have a different sensitivity, even though they had more scriptural knowledge than their Gentile fellow believers. They would have a different set of sensitivities than the Gentile believers would.
Yeah.
And Paul makes room for that. He doesn't think it's necessary to unify opinion on a bunch of peripheral things, but the Gospels and the Apostles were unified on the essential things.
Yeah. So there's a difference between unity and uniformity. And the Watchtower has not made any allowance for those things at all. It has to be, unity means everyone does the exact same thing.
Yeah.
So when they look at Christendom, they don't see that. So then they say they're not unified. And that's their criticism of them. But really, I think the Christendom is following this advice and not making it a standard of whether or not you're a Christian, or whether or not you're truly devoted to God, that you're somehow a compromiser if you don't agree with someone else on a specific manner.
There's no room for different background, there's no room for conscience, there's no room for maturity levels in this view of how people conform to this standard or definition of unity, which is not unity, it is uniformity. And I think a good example of that would be what you would call the Lord's Supper, or with the other names. I think the churches generally are agreed on one thing that Jehovah's Witnesses are not agreed with them upon, and that is that everybody is a partaker.
Yeah, everyone is a partaker. It's an important event. It should be done. But then they have their differences as to what to call it.
For instance?
So they will call it communion, the Lord's table. They will call it
the Mass.
The Mass. Eucharist. I never even knew what that word meant when I used to see it on church songs.
The Greek word for thanking or thanks.
So they might have differences like that. They may have differences as to how they go about serving communion.
Yeah.
Do they pass it along in little cups, or do you go up and all drink from one cup?
What's in the cup?
Yeah, is it wine or is it juice?
Then the bread.
Is it what kind of bread? Just the formal way of doing it may differ from church to church.
But they're all unified on the necessity of every Christian eating Christ's body and drinking Christ's blood in obedience to the command of the New Testament.
Yeah, and they recognize other churches do this, and accept that. this is an important thing for us all to do.
Now that interestingly plays out as a lot of people with different sensitivities will not think of doing the Eucharist in a specific way that other Christians do.
Yeah, they would not
they would
feel
they would go to a
comfortable.
church where they can do it their way,
Yeah,
but they won't judge as worthy of eternal
yeah.
damnation those who differ with them.
But they know that they have to follow their own conscience as to how they do it. Otherwise, they're violating their own conscience.
So they therefore are applying verse 22, which is, blessed is the one who has no reason to pass judgment on himself. Ooh, not on others, he says, on himself for what he approves.
Yeah.
So he's saying, don't judge each other. If you're going to judge anybody, judge yourself, because if you do judge, you're in fact you're destroying the unity of the body.
Yeah, yeah. And you may be stumbling a brother
You may be stumbling someone
by
else.
doing that.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So in the next segment, Ray attacks the subhead of the major period of theocratic legislation, which turns out to be the 1950s, after the official doctrine of disfellowshipping took hold, the doctrine that is still being enforced these nearly 70 years later.
Mm-hmm.